Hey everyone, remember this? Just a few years ago, we built this PC together, you and I showed you step by step how to do it from scratch, how to choose your parts, how to put it together, how to test it, how to install all your software. We had a grand time, I think. But like any computer that you build, eventually the time comes where you want to upgrade it. And that is one of the best parts of building your own, is you get to do that. Now for this, I have the great fortune of having the new Intel Arc A770 graphics card right here. I am honestly thrilled to get the chance to test this out. I also have the A750, which you may have noticed, and we're gonna pop this into this computer to run some tests on productivity software. I really wanna see how this works for things like Adobe Creative Suite, DaVinci Resolve, things like that. But not only are we upgrading the GPU, but I'm also gonna be upgrading the vast majority of this computer, the motherboard, the CPU, and the RAM. Of course, I'm gonna keep what I can from it, including the solid-state drives, the main hard drive, CPU fan, and the case, but we're upgrading it for really just one reason, and that's because I want to take advantage of something called HyperEncode, which combines the hardware encoding capabilities of the A770 with that of the quick sync encoder on the CPU. This is the Core i7-13700K. This is on the new 13th Gen series chips. But HyperEncode is only available on 12th and 13th Gen, whereas we here have a 9900KF in the computer. So a little too old. CPU is still great, by the way, but it is unfortunately not compatible with HyperEncode, which is why we're overhauling the whole system. We can't save RAM because we're switching to DDR5 here. And you may notice that we actually have a Z690 series motherboard here, which is technically a 12th Gen series, but is compatible with the 13th Gen CPU. So we're able to move along. I'm gonna really blaze through this today because unlike the last video, I'm not gonna go through the entire build process, but I will show you how you can save certain parts, upgrade what you have, and try to make the most of your existing build. Now, as a general precaution, suggestion I have for people who are doing an upgrade like this is that you should always back up what you have, because I prefer and I highly recommend that you do a fresh OS installation. I'm gonna do one here. So I've already backed up what I needed. It wasn't much, but we have that just sitting on flash drives. I've also gone ahead and downloaded all the drivers for this motherboard in advance so that when I start up, I don't have to worry about downloading anything. I don't have to worry about finding the latest version versus the one that automatically downloads. And it just speeds up the process overall. So before we begin, what can we save? Well, we obviously can't save the motherboard, RAM, and CPU. We're changing those. But we can save the case because cases are largely standardized and there's no reason to upgrade this. I have no desire to add much more to this in terms of cards or drives. It's all good. We can save the CPU cooler, surprisingly enough, because we were lucky enough to get an upgrade kit for the new mount. Now, I can also save the wireless unit, but I don't really need to because this has Wi-Fi built in. I can save the solid-state drive and I can save the hard drive. Now, what's gonna happen with all that old leftover hardware? Well, first off, it's not that old. It's, what, 3 years old? That's great these days. Computers last a long time now, but that's for a future video. So let's clear the workspace, open up the case, and start taking apart this computer so I can finally do some upgrades. Okay, so here is our 2020 build. As I said back then, save your motherboard box. I have ours here with all the documentation, extra cables, brackets, and screws, which will come in handy today. I'll open the case up and get started. We need to take out the GPU and the Wi-Fi cards first, disconnect all the cabling, and then take the motherboard itself out with the cooler still attached. Out come the expansion cards. The PCIe slot for the GPU has a latch on it that locks the card into place, so you might need to delicately push the latch down with a flathead screwdriver or similar if you can't physically access it with your hands like I'm doing here. Next come the motherboard screws. I also took out the case fans to make it easier to angle the board out. All the power has been disconnected, all the screws are out from the board so it's no longer affixed to the case. And I have left some things on here. Obviously the CPU cooler, heatsink, and the CPU itself are here. The RAM is here, and so is the SSD. And that's because I'd rather just reach in as it's already out of the case. It's a lot easier that way. Plus I can start prepping the case itself. All the cables are just here. Make sure they're out of the way as you try to take this out. So yeah, let's just go for it. I'm gonna lift it slowly, making sure that all the cables are out of the way. You may have to wiggle it just a bit, and it should come out fairly easily. There we go. So that's the entire board out with the CPU still on it. I'm gonna put that to the side for now. So first things first, I'm gonna take this out, just put it aside. We're not gonna put it inside, because last time I did that before putting the fan in, I made it very difficult for myself by putting the fan and everything on inside. I had to do so much reworking to get it to fit, but now I learned my lesson. We're gonna do it outside. So let's take off the cooler and heatsink. After unscrewing it, I'll carefully lift the heatsink off the CPU, revealing the thermal paste we originally applied back then. You'll want to clean the surface of the CPU and the heatsink to remove the old paste using rubbing alcohol and lint-free wipes. In this case, I used camera lens wipes, which did the trick. Then I took out the NVMe drives and dusted the empty case thoroughly, not forgetting to take out the old I/O grill. Now onto the new motherboard. I unlocked the CPU tray, removed the plastic cover, and carefully placed the new 13700K into the socket. I put the NVMe drives back onto the board, followed by the new DDR5 RAM. So I've already got these attached here, the screws and washers on top of a back plate. I'm gonna put that on underneath the monitor. I'm sorry, not the monitor, the motherboard. And then just flip it back down. Make sure it doesn't fall out like it just did. The Darkrock 4 cooler we had before needed to be upgraded to support the new socket. So I have fixed those and then applied some thermal paste to the CPU. But I'm redoing this bracket because the instructions kind of misguided me in putting them this way, sort of parallel to all the PCIe lanes instead of this way parallel to the RAM, which is the typical way, but I was trying to follow their instructions. It's not a big deal. Finally, it's time to put in the new board. So here we go, got it right here. The CPU and the cooler are on, RAM is in, SSD is in. So once we get it in here, we can start connecting all the cables. So I'm gonna make sure that I angle everything out of the way. Be very careful, just delicately start leaning it in. Making sure to move any power cables out of the way. And aligning the I/O ports on the back. Just gotta get that cable out of the way. Great. Okay, seated it in. And it looks like we've got everything in there. Okay, time to screw the new board into the case. After that, I replugged the front panel headers and power cables. Then, at last, came the GPU. The Arc A770 and A750 both use an 8-pin and 6-pin connection from the power supply, so there's nothing too crazy here. At last, we are done. I've got everything in here. The only thing that kind of tripped me up a bit was the CPU cooler. As I said, the instructions had me placing the bracket the wrong way. I got it fixed, it's all good. The other thing was that this board now requires an additional ATX 12-volt connection. So I had to run another wire in and then get a couple of more headers placed on the board. Something that's very interesting. I have no idea what it's used for yet. I guess we'll find out when we set everything up, but there is actually a USB header that comes from the Arc card to the board, and I have no idea what it's for. I thought all communication could be done through the board itself, so not sure why, but we'll find out soon enough. And then everything else kind of sat back in here just fine. I'm shocked at the clearance on the CPU fan. I'm shocked in the clearance of the fans themselves. So I'm gonna close this up. We're gonna take a break. I'll come back next week to shoot a little bit more, and we'll finally put this to the test. Well, 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 here we are, everyone. Welcome to our new desk and studio space. What better way to inaugurate it than with a new computer? I can't think of a better way. So, unlike our past video where we went through the first boot up and software installation, we're gonna skip all that today and go straight to the tests. One thing I do want to mention though is that yes, we did in fact have to update the BIOS of the motherboard to support the 13700K, and the process was flawless. For those following a similar upgrade path, always check for a newer BIOS revision that supports the newest CPU. Anyway, first impressions, installing the Arc drivers was easy, and since Intel's driver assistant makes it as effortless as their chipset drivers, I didn't have to bother downloading a separate driver package for the Arc card. I gotta say, the UI and general layout of the Arc drivers is refreshingly clean and simple. You have pages for general driver overview to check updates, a games page which lets you customize graphics settings on the GPU level with auto detection of installed games, and a performance tab which gives you a clean readout of GPU and system resources in general. There's also an entire streaming section for streaming gameplay directly from the card, but we've got a lot to talk about here, so let's move on. Adobe Premiere Performance is normally split between CPU and GPU depending on what you're doing, but I chose a fairly basic project here to simply scrub through and see how the GPU is being hit. The Arc series works in Premiere's Mercury engine via OpenCL, and right out of the gate, that's really good news. Scrubbing and shuttling through the timeline was super fast with only minor pauses here and there. And yes, the 13700K we have in here definitely does have an impact on performance. But looking over at the Arc Performance page, CPU utilization was actually very low, usually around 5% or so, with the occasional spike in usage, while GPU performance was around 17 to 22%, with the occasional tick up to around 40%. It's fascinating to see the VRAM usage and throughput, by the way. The real test, of course, was rendering though, which surprised me even more. Since we're interested in the quick sync encoder, I immediately went to HEVC and encoded a 14-minute, 10-second video at 35 megabits in 4K. Shockingly, the CPU was still down to about 2 to 5%, while GPU use was decently utilized at around 40 to 60% depending on the scene. This is not what I expected, and clearly Premiere can utilize the Arc cards pretty well. Granted, this percentage is likely split between GPU rendering and GPU encoding, but still, it's promising. The resulting file completed in just 7 minutes, 33 seconds. Moving over to DaVinci Resolve, I opened another project and did pretty much the same test, though of course with a different project. Hardware HEVC and 4K output at 35 megabits. For an 11-minute, 20-second long project, which admittedly was more complex than our Premiere test, the file completed in 13 minutes, 55 seconds. Now, hold on a sec. Compared to the rest of the tests, this was the only one where performance left something to be desired, but this could come down to optimization, or more specifically, the complexity of the project. There was a particular shot in this video where a 96 megapixel still image appears on screen that brought the export to a crawl. By crawl, I mean 0.5 to 1 FPS, yes. Contrast that to the rest of the export running well over 30 FPS in most sections, sometimes up to 70. It's likely that there's a bottleneck somewhere in the process, and this is probably not indicative of overall performance. Shuttling and scrubbing performance was responsive and snappy, as you can see. Resolve would occasionally ping the CPU into the 70% range, but usually settled down into the 5 to 10% area, with the GPU sitting around 30% pretty consistently. Now, during the render test, CPU use again hit around 5 to 10% most of the time, with the GPU saturating up to the mid-80s, sometimes up to the mid-90s. Now, as far as utilization is concerned, this is pretty good to see. But also, like I said, this was the only test where the performance was lacking. Now, here's where things get interesting. I normally look at HandBrake to compare CPU-based software encoding to hardware encoding, but in this case, I wanted to look at HandBrake for two features it offers over other options, for now at least. One is its support for AV1 encoding. AV1 is a new video compression format that promises even more efficiency than HEVC, and its main draw, of course, is that it's a royalty-free codec. Now, that's a bigger conversation for a different video, but what matters here is that the Arc cards are some of the first easily accessible hardware AV1 encoders you can get, along, of course, with the 13th gen Intel CPUs as well. HandBrake gives us easy access to those encoders. The other key feature here that's a little more difficult to isolate is Intel's HyperEncode, which combines the power of the quick sync encoder on the CPU with the Arc's encoders as well, giving you even faster output. From what I can gather, this is an automatic process for HandBrake, as there doesn't seem to be a toggle that enables or disables HyperEncode. But just to be sure, I'm going to compare this to a straight Adobe Media Encode process as well. So here's what I did. I created a ProRes version of our Premiere project from earlier to give HandBrake a clean starting point. This also means that it has to be CPU decoded. I then exported a hardware HEVC file, this time only at 15 megabits, which I'll explain in a bit, HandBrake finished the file in just 5 minutes, 25 seconds at an average of 63.88 FPS. In other words, very fast. I then took this same ProRes file back into Adobe Media Encoder and ran the same encode at 15 megabits again. Now, to my knowledge, Premiere doesn't yet utilize HyperEncode, or at least there's no documentation that indicates this. The file completed in 8 minutes, 12 seconds. Now, DaVinci Resolve also claims to support HyperEncode, and AV1 for that matter. Putting the same file through there resulted in an encode time of 5 minutes, 45 seconds. That's just 20 seconds longer than HandBrake, which means we can probably safely say that they're using the additional hardware resources over Premiere. By the way, how does AV1 compare to HEVC at such a low bitrate? I exported 15 megabits in this test because, quite frankly, it's a tragically low bitrate to use for 4K video, and that's kind of the point anytime there's a new codec on the scene. Here's a handful of 200% cropped still frames from both to give you an idea. So for our last test, I wanted to do something a little different. Topaz Video Enhanced AI is a marvelous program. Really, it's like magic, and if you've never used it on some of your videos, it's astonishing what it can do. But I digress. AI video processing is extremely intensive and slow to do even on the highest end hardware you can get. So I went through 2 workflows to see how it performed. We don't really have a baseline here, so you'll have to draw your own conclusions compared to your own hardware, but here are some numbers. First, I tried denoising some footage. The source was a 4K ProRes file that had been color graded to really show just how noisy the clip was originally. By default, Topaz renders out 2-second previews, which we used as our measurement because it's already slow enough. Denoising a 4K clip with the Proteus model resulted in a render speed of 1.8 FPS. I know, that's slow. Next, I tried a different challenge, grabbing an ancient clip from the B&H channel, 13 years old in fact, and upscaling it to 4K. The lower input resolution clearly has an impact on performance here because it actually rendered at a faster 3.2 FPS. That's considerably faster, even if the numbers are still painfully low. Out of curiosity though, I upscaled the same clip to only 1080p, not 4K, leaving all other settings the same and managed to get 11 FPS. In the real world, this is all pretty good performance for this kind of process. So most of our testing has been on the A770 version of the card, but we also have the A750, which is slightly cut down from the 770. So let's take a quick look at the specs without getting too much in the weeds here. The A770 and A750 feature 4096 and 3584 cores respectively, running at base clock speeds of 2100 MHz and 2050 MHz, so not much difference there. Interestingly, they both boost up to 2400 MHz. The most important difference though is the option for either 8 or 16 gigabytes on the A770, whereas the A750 only comes in 8 gigabytes. Now again, out of curiosity, I swapped the cards and ran a few small tests on the A750 to see how it compared to the A770. Back over in Premiere, scrubbing and shuttling performance felt about the same, and indeed CPU and GPU utilization was about the same too. Exporting that same 35 megabit 4K HEVC file, GPU utilization was somewhat lower than the A770, though memory usage was about the same. This resulted in a slower overall render time of 9 minutes 29 seconds. On the strict HyperEncode test, I went back to HandBrake using a ProRes source again. I expected this result to be nearly identical since these kind of features are usually baked into the hardware, and I think I was right. The encode finished in 5 minutes 33 seconds, which is neck and neck with the A770. Now lastly, I wanted to see if the loss of cores had any impact on Topaz since it can saturate the GPU so much. Surprisingly, there wasn't really any loss of performance here. The 4K denoising was barely any slower at 1.6 to 1.7 FPS, whereas the 4K and 1080p upscale tests resulted in 3.3 FPS and 10.6 FPS respectively. We didn't test games for this video, but if I had to guess, the performance between the two is probably quite similar, except for cases of heavy VRAM use, where textures could benefit from the additional memory on the A770. It's worth noting that the only time I saw VRAM use jump dramatically on the A770 was with the 96 megapixel image in DaVinci Resolve. It's these sort of edge cases that might make you consider one over the other, but in general, it seems that their performance in video software is actually quite similar, which is even better news for the budget conscious among you. So we covered a lot today, didn't we? I love any excuse to build a computer, or upgrade one for that matter, and the Arc series had me excited to try something truly new and different with this build. As a new entry in the performance GPU space though, there are naturally a lot of questions for pretty much every user out there. Well, as far as productivity and video editing are concerned though, I am happy to say that the performance of the Arc series is phenomenal, especially at this price point. Not only does it perform well in general GPU acceleration as we saw with video scrubbing and shuttling, but it has an extensive hardware encoding feature set that isn't available on pretty much any other CPU or GPU. For those wondering, you get full HEVC 10-bit 422 decode and encode here. AV1 10-bit decode and encode, also completely new. And on the A770, you get 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which is unmatched on any other card in this price range. Combined, that is simply huge for video editing in particular. And at last, that's our time with the Intel Arc A770 and A750. Our computer has been revitalized with some beefy new hardware, which I gotta be honest, for what is basically Intel's first generation effort here, I'm very impressed. If you're looking for a new video card for your editing workstation, I can't recommend the Arc series enough. And I know we didn't get to talk about it, but don't forget, they're very capable gaming GPUs as well, with support for ray tracing, XeSS upscaling, and the latest HDMI and DisplayPort connections. So, let us know how you could use the Intel Arc series in your next build in the comments below. My name is Doug, and I'll see you next time.